opportunity, to be honest, to be able to stand there and talk about ASPRO, because one of the reasons I wanted to do this today was to raise a bit of awareness about what ASPRO is, what it does, why it's there. And the role has become quite critical, really, with the following the Hansford review and the delivery of open for business type projects with local authorities to basically welcome an external funding into the railway. The ASPRO team now support those third parties in work, so we'll explore that a bit more. I'm a project engineering manager. I sit in Network Rail. My role at the moment is working with asset protection, even though I sit in capital delivery. Strange relationship. My background ranges from maintenance. I started as a track technical officer in maintenance, worked through there, moved on, did some S&C renewals for a fair period of time, started working in enhancements, then took more of a development role and a little shortcut into the design world for a while. Realised that wasn't the place for me. And following my time in development, I got asked to work with ASPRO simply because of the volume of third-party works that is now coming into the railway. So I'll move on to the first slide. I probably just said a lot of that, but I want to explain why Network Rail need to do asset protection, also how we support third-party projects. I want to give an overview of the requirements on third-party and outside-party clients and their suppliers, and to promote the role of asset protection so that everyone in the industry knows why it's there and what it does, and wants to engage with us to help deliver their projects. And the last slide, possibly the most diverse portfolio you'll ever come across. And I don't say that lightly because I've moved around the business a lot. And some of the work, the diversity is incredible. It ranges from people maintaining their fence next to the railway through to major junction enhancements, and major new stations in some cases, which we'll get into shortly. So I've mentioned a couple of things already, outside parties and third parties. And this gets a little bit confusing if you don't kind of come back to some of the key principles. And that is outside party works. They're not railway projects. They're people who work alongside the railway. They're our neighbours. They're people who maybe want to put a bridge over the railway, local authority. There might be somebody cutting trees down next to the railway. But the key thing is there is an impact on the railway. If anything they do goes wrong, there will be an impact on the railway. It will impact performance, potentially cause safety-related problems. Third-party works, on the other hand, are about the creation of new railway assets or changing existing assets. So Network Rail aren't delivering that work. We've got a third-party client who appoint a principal contractor, principal designer. They need to work with ASPRO to help them deliver that project, because ultimately it's our railway, we're the infrastructure manager. We need to allow them access to do the work. We need to ensure that whatever they do complies with standards, because at the end of that work, it becomes a Network Rail asset, and then we're liable for maintenance, renewal, etc., etc. The other aspect of work the team do is managing land clearance activities. We touch on that in a bit, but essentially that's where Network Rail property sold to developers to build adjacent to the railway. So we do have legal obligations, which is why we're here. This is why ASPRO exists as a function. The Railway Act and Network Rail's licence places a legal duty on us to provide assurance that the railway is safe to use and to work within. So the Health and Safety at Work Act and CDM regs place obligations on us whenever we do construction work. And likewise, it places similar obligations on the outside parties and third parties. And remember, the current issue of CDM regulations applies to domestic clients as well. So if you're extending your property up to the boundary of the railway, you are the client in the eyes of the law. And I don't think many clients would know that. sure many of the small building companies don't realise they're a principal contractor. So that's by the by. So asset protection, the asset is the rail infrastructure. It's valuable, you know, millions, billions of pounds worth of assets out there. It's also a dangerous place to work. So we protect the infrastructure, which is things we know and love, track signalling, electrification, etc. We're protecting the people that work on the infrastructure and the users of the infrastructure, passengers, freight users, etc. And we protect the outside parties themselves. If somebody's working adjacent to the railway, we've got an obligation to make sure that they're safe. This little picture here is probably example one of the diverse nature of ASPRO. Does anybody recognise that picture? Yeah. So that's, I was going to say little Tom Cruise, but that's probably not the way to say it. So Tom Cruise here filming Mission Impossible, running across the roof of Blackfriars Station. Now ASPRO have to support that, risk assess it, make sure that he's not running on anything he shouldn't. So that's a really diverse example of things that ASPRO do, and I'm sure there's hundreds of other films that you would probably know and love. I'm thinking Harry Potter at King's Cross maybe. And that requires ASPRO support, whether that's site safety staff, taking possession of railway lines if they may be filming on the infrastructure. So yeah, I quite like that picture. Scope of ASPRO is wide and varied depending on what the project is, the complexity of it, what's been done to the infrastructure or what's been done around the infrastructure. So there's a lot of words on there, I probably won't read them all. The thing you'll pick up from it is about understanding risk. That's probably priority one. What's the risks to the railway? We assess those risks. In the case of outside parties, we help them with mitigating measures to prevent those risks from occurring. And we check the control measures are in place when they're actually doing the work. So we have safety supervision on site, you know, maybe dropping in and out, maybe a permanent feature of the work. We work with the asset management team and other internal stakeholders, particularly on third-party works, where ultimately they become the owners of those changes to the railway. And similar to our colleagues in capital delivery, we act as a DPE. We make sure there's system integration taking place. We check designers are, you know, coordinating their activities in the way that we would expect as Network Rail, so that the end product is as we would deliver, I guess, as a capital delivery team. We do readiness reviews, so approaching major possessions, we'll sit with the various teams, do readiness reviews, T-8, T-4, etc., checking that they're ready to go for the possession they've got booked. And we provide a protection staff, you know, to look after those sites when people are working on our infrastructure, making sure that whatever they've done is handed back safely at the possession. And I think that the key thing for me is the ASPRO team. We quite often work with customers that aren't railway people, particularly on outside party projects. And that's really challenging because you're talking a different language. You've got to convey railway things into normal people speak. And a lot of people don't understand why they need to do it. So explaining these are the risks, these are the consequences, this is why we have to do what we do. Unfortunately, this is how much it will cost you to engage with ASPRO, which for domestic clients can be, you know, quite a hard thing to take. We have to make sure they understand their obligations. They are a client in the eyes of the law, as we said, under CDM. They have to take the necessary steps to protect others from the work that they're undertaking. On the last point, specialist support. So in Network Rail, you know, we have fire engineers, security specialists, etc. Those people are essential when we're working, say, around stations and public areas. So to engage with ASPRO, we have what we call agreements, essentially like a contract to engage with us. So it clarifies what each other's responsibilities are and what we're going to be delivering as part of the project. We clarify the scope of work so that we all know what the output's going to look like. We establish how much it's going to cost so that that can be factored into a client's budget. And in doing that, we're also trying to influence the programme as well to make sure that things like design reviews and things are scheduled in, so that if you're a client, you submit your design to Network Rail and we say, well, we can't look at it for a couple of weeks, and the chances are they want it quicker. So we set out up front, these are the terms, you've got to give us enough notice to react to things. And we're clear on liabilities and any insurances that need to be in place before the work starts. And all of our agreements are on templated documents, which are set out by the ORR, the Office of the Rail Regulator. So all of those are agreed formats that we use. And there are 4 main types of agreements. Basic services agreement, which is for professional services, mainly used in sort of development phases of work. Basic asset protection agreements, which is about physical work on site, and often through design into physical work on site. Asset protection agreements for major works. And then where we've got over bridges being constructed, we have what we call a bridge agreement. So you can see that picture there, that's Plymouth Station. And the building above the station, I'd say standard sort of 1960s, a bit like Signal Point out here in Swindon. That building has now been occupied by the university in Plymouth, turning it into student accommodation. Just the other side of that building is the railway line, so we've clearly got a risk during construction. But there's other interesting things about that in the basement of that building are some railway power supplies and equipment, which we've had to obviously asset protect as well during the works. That's another diverse example. We've got other agreements in terms of way leave agreements. So if we sell a piece of land off to a third party, but we still need access through it, for example, we have way leave agreements. And depot lease and station lease agreements. So if you think of any station that is managed and operated by, say, GWR or a train operating company, it's still Network Rail assets. It's still a Network Rail facility, but it's leased to the train operating company to operate and manage. So they can do general day-to-day maintenance under a station lease agreement, likewise with a depot, if we're talking about a train care depot. But the responsibility for renewal and repair, so anything more than maintenance, still lies with Network Rail. So they are allowed to do certain works under what we call landlord's consent. And that goes to the asset management team. Sometimes they'll say, actually, the scale of this is a bit bigger than changing a light bulb. You need to engage the asset protection team. So that's depots and stations. We've got quite a few works going on at the moment, station upgrades, depot upgrades, particularly in Wales, where they've got a lot of new rolling stock. So we work closely with the third party there, it's Transport for Wales, to upgrade those depots. Yeah, the final thing, I think I mentioned earlier, clearances, where we sell land. We've got people in our team that manage that, working with Network Rail property. So the first example really of an outside party job is plant working next to the railway. So in the diagram there, you've got a crane. You see its working radius, which is obviously smaller than the collapse radius. So if that crane were to fall over, you can see that that would interfere with the railway. So when we've got activities like this going on, and there are, when you catch a train today, you will see examples of this everywhere. We need method statements, risk assessments, temporary works design, and generally we have people checking on site as well. The key thing with something like this, we've got other examples of piling rigs to look at in a minute. This might not be our land. The chances are it isn't if it's an outside party job. We don't know the condition of that ground. We don't know what they're sitting that crane on. So they need to demonstrate that they've made that as safe as possible. And that could be, here's the ground investigation results. We've proven the ground bearing capacity is enough to be able to support this crane. It could be we need to see some temporary works design so that they can create a pad for that crane to operate on. That's one quick example. So some considerations when we're using this kind of plant next to the railway. Can the lift be undertaken within the collapse radius so that if it did collapse, it's not going to encroach on the railway? Can we put a slew restriction on the jib to prevent that same thing, basically making the piece of kit smaller? If you can, then great, we'll have a look at the working platform just to check that. If you can't do that, then maybe you need a possession to undertake those activities because the risk of that collapse onto the track just isn't tolerable. And then method statements, how are you doing it, when are you doing it, what are the various crane positions that you need to be using to do that work. And that's all reviewed by our team before they're given the thumbs up to carry on. Big risk with outside party work is if they don't engage with us and we know absolutely nothing about it and they're not taking any measures because they just haven't considered the railway. That's a bigger risk because we won't know what's going on. We won't know where the risk areas are. We've got absolutely no control over any of that. So piling rigs, and that's the dramatic photo I used for the mail shot that you'd have probably seen. I don't know where it is. I don't know where it fell over, but it was such a great picture I could not use it. Piling rigs should look like that. They should be upright, not on their side. You can see how close some of these activities are to the railway. I mean, that I'm guessing you're maybe 5 or 6 meters. If we say something's within 4 meters, then you're effectively, you know you're in the track support zone. You know you've got an interface with the railway. When you're here, there are still potential interfaces. We don't know what that ground is like because it's outside our fence line. It's never worked there before. Piling rigs come in various shapes and sizes. See, this one is on a concrete pad. Even this fence line would have been assessed by ASPRO because a bit of wind, that fence is potentially a danger to trains as well. Tower cranes, similar sort of risks. They're more of a permanent fixture, I would say, in a construction site. So even though they're temporary, they're probably there for a longer period than a mobile crane. Generally, moving heavy equipment higher, further. It could be a saddle crane. Still, we're considering the collapse radius. We're considering whether there's slew restrictions. Does that crane ever need to oversail the railway? There's something called a license for oversailing to manage that. We've got a design check certificate for their foundations for this tower crane. It's semi-permanent work, so we call it. There will be a foundation design required for that. Do we need to downrate the crane to reduce the risk so it may be capable of lifting X tons? Do we say, actually, we want you to reduce that amount because we need to reduce the risk? We need to see how they're going to build it. Tower cranes, as you can imagine, take a while to put up. Do they need another crane to build that tower crane? You know, we need to understand that methodology and how it's going to be dismantled. And how often do we need to be on site? Do we need permanent rail safety supervision, or are we happy to just keep it, you know, once a week, watch and brief? Track support zone. So for most, you know, I'm a track engineer by trade. We know the track support zone. A lot of other disciplines now understand this, which is great. You know, especially when we were doing electrification on the main line, this was a big issue. People piling next to the track. You know, how are we monitoring that track? How are we monitoring the settlement? Crossrail down in London. I mean, there was a lot of monitoring took place when they were tunnelling in the Paddington station and the tracks around there. We've now got HS2. We've got Aldo Common station being built, which I know Chris Ford spoke about a couple of weeks ago. You know, there's a hell of a lot of track monitoring required there. There are tunnels under our network. And in this example, you can see, you know, the work on the side, building the shaft, starts to interfere with the track support zone when it gets to a certain depth. And all of that design is quite, you know, it takes into account track support zone, it takes into account pile foundations for OLE, you know, they could ultimately be affected by settlement as well. But we had a recent example in Wales, where there's a construction site next to the railway. They want to do some dewatering, so they provided some figures, settlement figures. They basically think it's going to settle 15 mil. So, okay, where's the track monitoring plan? We'll monitor that and we'll react accordingly. But some things you wouldn't necessarily think, well, why is that going to cause track settlement? Anybody that's done any kind of civils and understands geology, if you've got a clay strata in that formation, you take water out of it, it's going to shrink. When that shrinks, the track can settle. So there's a lot of things that perhaps we don't normally think about in terms of track support zone that come up through ASPRO projects, because they're activities that we as the railway might not do very often or very occasionally. So spotting the risk, I think, is important. No matter what the work is, it is thinking about broader than the railway. Some typical examples: under track crossings, piling, retaining walls, excavations, tunnels. We need design submissions for all of those things. We need to know what they're doing under the railway. We need the settlement predictions. We need evidence of ground investigation. We need on-call arrangements in place for when they're doing the work, so that if things start to shift, we've got a contingency plan. The asset management plan, so all this is done through AMP, as we call it. And yeah, the track monitoring, you know, tailor that to the risk, I guess, depending on the expected movement. Another thing you'll see quite regularly, scaffolding. So we saw the Plymouth station example just now, which is quite a hefty piece of scaffolding. This could be scaffolding, or it could be hoarding to protect the development. There's obviously, as with the plant, there's a risk of collapse onto the railway with this. There's a risk of things being blocked off the scaffold, tools, God knows what else that could enter the railway environment. So that's another example of some scaffolding on the right-hand side. You can see how tight that is to the operational the railway. So is it going to collapse beyond the boundary fence? It might be on the boundary fence. It might be within the boundary fence in some cases. We need temporary works designs for those. We need to understand ground conditions again. What's the scaffold going to be sat on? The method statements, risk assessments, so that you get a picture of what kind of thing we're looking for. If you've got OLE, does that scaffold need bonding? I'm guessing that's something most scaffolders that they work in the railway environment say, well, what does that mean? What have we got to do? They will need a license if they erect scaffold on Network Rail land. And they need to consider wind loading. You know, some of these scaffolds are stories high. We've got a new one started up at West Ealing station, where the scaffolding will be literally on the boundary wall, and it's an 8-storey building. So that's a job for the future. Also growing at West Ealing. And then probably one of the rarer ones, I guess, unless we're talking about road bridges, where people are building over the railway. You know, from an infrastructure perspective, we've obviously got to consider gauge clearance, electrical clearance, all of those sort of things. But, you know, depending on the length of this, we may need to consider, well, what does that do to access to our assets? You know, if this is, I don't know whether any of you remember, there was a tunnel built with that kind of construction. I think they built Tesco's on top of it, somewhere up north. You know, that's creating a tunnel. Are there any critical assets in that area that we need to gain access to? You know, S&C in there, for example. So those kind of considerations. So that kind of work, we need a bridge agreement. We need possession of the line, obviously, to install it. We would have people working on that, you know, site supervision, isolations. So if you were trying to put this into context, really, if you were an outside party delivering that work, and you've got an estimate to build this bridge, say, and you've not factored in all the Network Rail programme requirements to get possessions, to get designs reviewed, to get acceptance from the asset management team to do this. You've not considered the cost of engaging with Network Rail. You'll very quickly run out of money. I can't emphasise how important it is that at concept stage, people need to come to Network Rail and talk about what they want to do, because we can provide early input, we can give an early heads up and say, you need to include for this now, because it needs to be budgeted for, and you need to understand our timescales to which we work. And all of that gets checked by us before it gets handed back at the end of possessions to make sure it's safe for passage of train. So that picture's clear. So large span overbridge. They're constructing parapet walls, and that one's decided it didn't want to be part of the bridge anymore. Whether the work's temporary or permanent, the impact's the same, and I think that's the key. The difference is the permanent works should be permanent. The temporary works, you're dismantling, you're moving, you're changing all the time, which is why the methodology is just so critical. We need to understand that methodology so that we can understand the risks at each stage of the construction. Again, I don't know where that came from. I borrowed some pictures. Fortunately, we don't have many horrible pictures from recent times. The supporting structures, similar considerations again. We talked about Crossrail, we talked about tunnels, we talked about track settlement. We need full design submissions for whatever it is that's been designed to go under the track. Some of these assets that go under the track may become Network Rail assets. Not all of them do. Some of them remain third-party assets. But having that upfront discussion, again, is really important to decide that, because that will sometimes change the way we approach things and how we assure things. Know your boundaries. So when you engage with ASPRO, if you're working alongside the track, we will agree where the safe limits of work are. That you can, effectively, you can design out the need for ASPRO. If you're smart enough and you find a way of segregating the works sufficiently so that there is no interface with the railway, you can design out the need for ASPRO. This person had erected a Harris fencing, and the pile of dirt there has started falling in towards the infrastructure. So they decided to move the fence out the way to get it back. That's not safe. You know, that machine could stray too close. We've now got a fence there that's not secure. So I think establishing your boundaries is really important. Understanding what are your areas of work, what are you safe to do in those areas, and do you need to go outside them? And it may be that you just need a little bit of ASPRO when you need to do certain activities. but being clear about that at the start is critical. It's one of my favourites. So that's Morrison's in Gloucester. And I don't know whether you know Gloucester, it's effectively a triangular bit of land between the railway. So you've got the main line, Bristol to Birmingham, comes off to the South Wales main line, and then goes back out the other way towards Bristol, forms a triangle. That land was sold off, used to be all Network Rail land, sold off for development. Part of the development was to build a Morrison's with a petrol station. And you would look at that, and its position even in the middle of this triangle, it's not close to the railway. It's probably 400 to 500 metres away from the railway line, that sign. And you would think, well, what's the risk there? Doesn't seem any issue. When you look at it from a train driver's perspective, the issue becomes a little bit more obvious. And if this was dark or foggy, cloudy, that green Morrison sign is now giving a driver a false aspect, which, you know, potentially lead to a SPAD. I think that just kind of, it's not very often we get a picture like that, of something that really makes sense. And people talk about these kind of things all the time, signal sighting. But when you see real life examples, you think, wow, would I have picked that up? I'm not so sure. The outcome was that light, the sign, the petrol sign, got changed to white LEDs, so it's no longer an issue. I guess you could have put a hoarding up or some sort of fence line to prevent the view. But yeah, that was quite an interesting one. So we talked a lot about outside parties, but third party work is probably more aligned to what I've done in other parts of my career. The outside party stuff is quite new to me, and I didn't realise how diverse outside party work was. But with the same sort of view, really, the third party projects that we see now are as big and complex as anything we deliver in Network Rail through capital delivery. And a lot of you who work for Atkins or other consultants could get involved in these projects and probably are involved in these projects. You're developing things like new stations for local councils. You might be working with a TOC in upgrading a depot, or a TOC in upgrading an existing station with new entrants, new passenger facilities. All of this work has to come through ASPRO because these are Network Rail assets, or will become Network Rail assets in some cases. This job I'm very close to. I've been working on that for over a year, and it was a whole new way of working for me. With Transport for Wales, the client, Alpha BT delivering the work, and designing the work, so principal designer and contractor. And the relationship's very different because ASPRO, we don't have a contract with those people. We've got a contract with the client to provide ASPRO services, but we don't have a relationship with the suppliers. So in capital delivery, we would have a contract with the designer and a mechanism for working with them. So it becomes much about collaboration more than anything, and being able to work with people in a way that is for the benefit of everyone. Under CDM, ASPRO isn't a duty holder. We're not the client, we're not the principal designer, we're not the principal contractor. But we provide duties to the client that he can't undertake himself in the creation of these things. So arguably we're doing some of the delegated duties of the client, working with the principal designer and contractor. So Holyhead is the depot, the carriage sidings. The scope was full track renewal, including number of S&C units, buffer stops, 3 lines here, new walkways, new bollards. At the other end of the depot, you've got fuel sidings. So extending the fuel sidings, which then involved stabilising a retaining wall, bringing in new facilities for the new trains, so ASPRO facilities, toilet emptying facilities, etc., potable water. Such a massive scope of work. Transport for Wales are the leaseholder on the depot, so all of those changes have to be documented through the depot change process. All of it has to be agreed with the RAMs because they ultimately will own the depot, even though it's leased back to TFW. So major piece of work. This is Marsh Barton Station, being developed with local authority. See, platforms are in here, the bridge is in. That one, I can't remember where it is. Got a feeling that's somewhere on the crossrail section.
Is that West Drayton?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah. Some other schemes. I'm just trying to give you a feel for the scope and the diversity of projects, really, that third parties are now delivering for network, well, not for Network Rail, for their own interests, but the creation of new Network Rail assets. So this is a station upgrade. There's a whole car park facility with electric vehicle charging points, new footbridge with lifts, fully accessible station. That's been funded by the local council. That's at Pontypool, the Newin station in Wales. This one you may recognise if you've been through Didcot, the multi-storey car park with perhaps the longest footbridge I've ever seen, linking it back to the station. So yeah, multi-storey car parks are interesting because again, you would look at that and say, well, it's nowhere near the railway line. Why do you need ASPRO to support that? Station car parks are part of our licence obligations as Network Rail. We have to provide a certain number of parking spaces. We have to provide a certain number of accessible parking spaces. And I'm guessing now it includes a number of electric vehicle charging points as well. Car park has to be certain dimensions to allow certain types of vehicles into it. So GWR, with a client for this one, Network Rail and ASPRO would have had a part to play in the scoping of that and setting requirements for it to ensure that when it is handed back to Network Rail as a Network Rail asset, it's compliant with our standards and we're happy to take it and maintain it. Other things that need to be considered are, you know, the ongoing liability for inspections and maintenance. Can you access all the parts you need to inspect? Are you going to hide any elements that will ultimately cost Network Rail more because they need to remove parts of the building to inspect? All of those things get, if we feed them in early into the requirements, very clear what the expectation is. Does anybody know where that depot is? No? That's Long Rock, down in Penzance. So fairly major depot upgrade there, new HST sheds. And sometimes these kind of works can include, you know, equipment within the depots as well. So, you know, that cranes for lifting trains off the wheel sets, etc. So they can be quite diverse scopes. You know, a lot of buildings type work, a lot of M&E type work, a lot of electrical supplies, real multidisciplinary stuff. Did I say about half an hour?
Dat doen we wel, Rick.
It's not my possession. So just to kind of recap, really, there is just so much diversity of scope that comes to ASPRO. And I think it's a really exciting place to be because you get exposed to the kind of projects that aren't always done within the railway environment. So that's quite exciting. Key point, if you take one thing away, if you're ever working on third-party or outside-party jobs, engage Network Rail as early as possible. Encourage your client to engage Network Rail as early as possible. Because we understand the railway risks, and sometimes outside parties don't, sometimes third parties don't. We know what's there. We've got so much information on our assets, and we know the condition of those assets, and we can share that with you or your client as pre-construction information, which helps plan and deliver the works. We know how to access the railway. We can arrange possessions, we can arrange isolations, we can arrange whatever's needed to facilitate the work. And if you follow the procedures, network rail standards, etc., and we can work together, then we can help those schemes be delivered safe and ultimately get them handed back where they need to be handed back to network rail. Or in the case of outside parties, they can open their new facilities for their public. I think that's all I've got to say. But some final things, if you need to contact Asset Protection, put some information on there. There is a portal on the Network Rail website where you can submit information in to Asset Protection. Or you can email the team directly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. So I'm going to invite the floor for questions.
You're on your Western, yeah?
Western and Wales. Yeah.
If you don't mind answering the question, how many staff do you have?
The team at the moment is around the 50 mark, I would say, and that's a mixture of engineers, so asset protection engineers, construction management type staff. You've got some sort of highways interface specialists and liabilities people. It's fairly, I would say the team isn't big enough, but whose team is big enough. And we do pull in a lot of resource. So, you know, for the volume of third-party work at the moment, we're reliant on the likes of capital delivery and framework suppliers to top up our resources. So yeah, it's a reasonable sized team, but probably should be a bit bigger.
Are there any questions online?
If anyone online would like to ask questions, do you put your hands up? No.
Okay, Nick, while people are thinking of more questions, I've got one regarding CSM and interoperability. So you gave some examples of the car park, for example, and what came to mind, because the discussion we've had at the time was the application of PRM onto third-party car parks. So how do you approach this railway-specific type of regulation with clients who don't know anything about the railway?
Good question. I deliberately left CSM out because I didn't want to talk about it. I'm joking. So CSM and interoperability, the client is the proposer of the change. And that's the important thing. It's their responsibility to demonstrate that they are complying with the legislation effectively. So our team assure, and we check that they don't have to use the CSM methods we use in Network Rail. We can't impose that on anyone. But what they do have to do is demonstrate that they are doing a level of system engineering assurance, i.e. creating things like hazard records. They can use their own format, and understanding the system interfaces, all of those things that we do in the CSM, they can do it in their own way. So we do assure those products. Quite often they'll say, well, have you got an example of something we can use? And we'll share the Network Rail templates to help them steer it in the right direction. And the same with interoperability, really. Quite often you'll find third-party clients will appoint their own system safety team. They will bring in, without naming too many, like Cardo or somebody, they'll bring in a specialist team to help them because they don't have that competence. Does that answer?
No, it does. It does. I think it's. I'm guessing it's the advice you give to third party who are not aware of the railway. So the value there is just beyond what you presented, which is the immediate risk. But it's expanding on CDM that you mentioned into CSM and interoperability.
Really. We will assure it, and you know, from my perspective, I would be looking for, have they done a hazard identification process, and how are those hazards being managed? Are we going to inherit any as Network Rail at the end of it? Or can we demonstrate through the design process that they put the right mitigations in there and that it's traceable? And I think that's the key, really, but in terms of our role, is looking at how they manage that process. and they demonstrate that clearly.
Okay, thank you.
We've got a question from James Thompson online. So James, would you like to come off mute and make your question, please?
Hi, I'm James Thompson. I'm an engineer for the Tyneway Metro system, and one thing I'm curious to know about is how do you consider sort of developments in the proximity of Network Rail's tunnels, i.e., sort of developments over and around, over and around tunnels?
So is that for new tunnels or existing tunnels?
Existing tunnels.
Oh, sorry. So Network Rail's assets, tunnels, and people wanting to develop around them.
Yeah, so on land on top of tunnels and things like that. Just sort of what sort of normal things would you sort of look to consider with that sort of outside party work?
Yeah. So you if you remember back to the slide, so we'd be looking for what's the proposal? What are they trying to build? What sort of foundations are they putting on there? What's the kind of loading conditions that are going to be placed on the tunnel? I mean, it's really trying to understand as much as possible about what they're doing, looking at our existing asset information and saying to the structures RAM or the tunnel RAM, you know, is this feasible? You know, would this be something you'd accept? Maybe the tunnel's already in a weakened state and we say, well, okay, you can do that, but you need to upgrade our tunnel first to enable it. So I think it's those early discussions, understanding the scope of work and the proposal, and then really, you know, risk assessments, understanding methodology, etc. You know, before you can offer any kind of requirements back to them, I think.
Cheers.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, any more questions in the room or online?
I can't see any more online. All hands up in the room.
An ASPRO specialist to dial in just to give me a hard time, but that hasn't happened.
Okay.
Quick question. The example of the Morrisons.
Yeah.
Interesting. Do you have sort of generic set of generic risks that, you know, in your register that you would, where you might include the effect of lights, distraction, because it's not just the infrastructure, it's drivers on the infrastructure. Yeah. Signal sighting is an obvious thing there, but road lighting, signage that could become a distraction.
Glare from buildings,
glare, line of sight issues that could affect a driver.
Yeah, I don't think we have a checklist, but it's a really good point because you know, people move around. We're lucky in ASPRO, we've got a few people that have been there for more than a decade. You know, a couple of people with like 20 years experience of ASPRO projects, which is quite rare, to be honest, to have people sat in those teams for that length of time. So it's a really good point. We should start to capture some of that knowledge, so that other people coming into the team have got something to refer to if they're not around anymore. But yeah, you're right. That whole system view is really important. It's not just about infrastructure, it's about the whole environment around the railway. But yeah.
Because if you do signal sighting, for example, those are the sorts of things that you're looking for.
Yeah.
You're sighting a signal, if there's something else that's reading. So you'd expect a similar thing.
The opposite way around almost.
The other way around.
Yeah.
Adding some distraction.
Yeah. Yeah, no, good point. I'll take that away.
Not a question, but an observation. When I worked on Crossrail, we were monitoring inside the London Underground tunnels. One of the issues was the direction of the monitoring prisms, facing away from the driver. Because if you put 360 prisms in there, all they see is an array of prisms that come along the tunnel, so they light it up.
Yeah.
It wasn't until it was in that somebody realised, oh, we've got to do something different.
Yeah.
But it had gone through all the approvals before.
There's always something in there. There's always something.
No, my phone's just...
Okay, nothing else.
Right.
Okay, so Nick, on behalf of everybody, I would like to thank you for your really interesting and engaging talk today. A lot of good pictures, and I think pictures that really drive home, your messages and make real, the issues that sometimes you don't write on paper. It was certainly interesting to see, same as your prison, the Morrison's sign and these sort of things that are very difficult to foresee. So, so to conclude, then, I'd like to invite everybody to thank Nick in the usual way. Okay, our next meeting is on the 19th of April. We haven't got the topic firm yet, but keep an eye on your email on the website to know what that's going to be. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.